Dear viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, all praise is due to God, Lord of the universe, and may God's peace and blessings be upon all of His prophets and messengers, including His final and beloved messenger, the seal of the prophets Muhammad, and His purified household and their righteous companions. God states in the Holy Quran, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا أن تصيبوا قوما بجهالة فتصبحوا على ما فعلتم نادمين. O you who believe, if an iniquitous person comes to you with news, then be discerning, lest you harm a people out of ignorance and become remorseful over what you have done. Amanna billah. Sadaqallahu al-Aliyyul Azim. It's becoming clearer day by day that we live in an age of disinformation, an age of widespread fake news. And we find that today there are many individuals and groups who exist in the world whose purpose and objective seems to be the creation and the promotion of disinformation, of fake news. They could be politicians, they could be governments, they could be corporations, they could be other kinds of organizations, or they could be a combination of some of these. And we find that the spread of disinformation and the spread of fake news is spread and it is used through the means of technology, and especially mass and social media, which many of us, we consume, we use. And so we find that we really live in an age of widespread disinformation. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the term or the concept of fake news refers to exactly what its name suggests. That is, false or manipulative information that is spread and that masquerades as the truth, as being real. And many media experts and researchers, they've been able to identify several broad categories of fake news and disinformation. There are several examples. One of these examples, or one of these types of fake news, is that which is focused entirely on deliberately manipulating people, on producing fake news and spreading it and manipulating the truth. And there are individuals, there are organizations, there are sectors that are invested in entirely creating and promoting fake news. So this is one category. There's another category that potentially it risks spreading fake news, but not deliberately, unintentionally. Sometimes we find individuals and groups and organizations and corporations who otherwise are trustworthy and they have integrity, but because perhaps they did not do their due diligence, because their sources were not that great, they didn't spend enough time and attention to verify their sources, they end up unintentionally spreading fake news and spreading propaganda. There's also another category, and that is what is referred to as the use of clickbait headlines. So we've probably come across this ourselves in our interactions online. You know, you're online, you're on social media, and you see an advertisement. And the advertisement has either an amusing or an exciting or a very curious sort of headline and maybe a photo. And you click on it and you find out that this was in fact an ad. It was an advertisement. But it is put together in such a way as to draw your attention, so that you stop scrolling on your social media feed and you make sure to click, because when you click on that ad, this generates revenue. And so the way that it is created, that content is created, is so that it attracts us, it seduces us, it grabs our attention. And a lot of people fall for this. And this is one other category of disinformation or fake news. And finally, there is another category, and that is those outlets and those organizations that create content that is satirical or comedic in nature. It's made to be critical, for instance, of the current political climate or any other things, and it's done in satire or in a comedic way. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that sometimes that information, which is clearly false and which is made in a way to, to garner attention and humor and entertainment, and that is used in a way that spreads sort of this disinformation unintentionally or intentionally sometimes, and that also causes all sorts of problems. And it must be noted, dear friends, that fake news and disinformation is extremely dangerous, because some people will say, well, it's just an advertisement. You're just clicking on an advertisement, you figure out that it's not real, then you click back. The story could not be real. What's the big deal? It is actually a very big deal, because the spread, and especially the widespread sort of disinformation and fake news, is very dangerous, because not only does it promote deceit and ignorance in society, but it also is dangerous to our individual and our collective political lives, our social lives, and even our physical well-being. There are many examples that we can give of how dangerous the spread of fake news is. It promotes mistrust in society. When we promote fake news, when it's all around us, this leads to a sense of mistrust between people. People are no longer capable of trusting one another. When you keep hearing deceiving things, when you're surrounded by deceit, this damages your sense of trust. You begin to mistrust others. I remember a while back, several years ago, hearing about a poll that asked Americans about their attitudes towards one another, and the vast majority of Americans expressed that they have mistrust of others around them. They mistrust others. And this, in part, is due to the spread of deceitful news, of deceitful information. So it creates a sense of mistrust between members in society. But it also undermines democracy. It undermines elections, as we have seen that in countries around the world, the spread of fake news and the spread of disinformation has undermined elections. And it has undermined political processes. Sometimes, unfortunately, this fake news, it leads to the spread of conspiracy theories. And these conspiracy theories, they lead to all sorts of dangerous events. You'll probably recall a few years ago, there was fake news about a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., a pizza shop, a place that makes pizza, that this place was used for trafficking of children. And this was completely fake. This news was made and it was completely fake, and it was spread widely. And this, in fact, led to a man who went armed and actually shot at this pizza shop, actually believing that this was a place in which a particular presidential candidate had a ring of pedophilia and trafficking of children. And so this man actually went to the place and he shot the pizza restaurant, the pizzeria. But it turned out that the news that he based his belief on was completely fake. It had absolutely no basis to it whatsoever. We find that fake news and the spread of disinformation leads to social and civil unrest, to protest, to rioting in some cases. And this causes all sorts of problems. It leads to problems with our physical, even our physical well-being. We've read many reports about people who they read something on the internet or they heard something on the news about a particular medication or a particular product that if you take this, if you consume this, it will cure a particular disease, and it caused all sorts of problems. It caused people to get sick. And this was a result of the spread of fake news, of disinformation campaigns. Caused people to become sick, some people die, because they believe in these things. And so there is a real and present danger with the spread of fake news, dear friends. And this danger is exacerbated exponentially with the use and the existence of technology and mass and social media. As I mentioned, the vast majority of us, we often use mass media, we consume mass media and social media. And the way that this fake news and disinformation is promoted is through the use of mass media and social media. There's a popular documentary going around right now. It's called The Social Dilemma. You've probably heard of it. You may have seen it. I just watched it recently, and this was an eye-opener, really an eye-opener. This was a documentary that featured several former executives of the major technology companies, tech companies, and social media companies, the major companies that we use often, some of their former executives and high-ranking employees and other researchers and academics who show in this documentary the extent to which we as social media users and consumers of mass media are being manipulated, Now, most of us, when we use our phones, when we, log into social media, we don't think of ourselves as being manipulated. But in fact, this is exactly what's happening. It was a mind-boggling documentary about the ways in which this is done. We assume that these services are free. We don't pay to log into many of these social media accounts, to have these accounts, to sign up for them. Many of the services that we use online, they're free. We assume that they are free, but in fact they are not. They are being paid for by advertisers. And those advertisers, in conjunction with the tech companies and the social media corporations, are using us as their product. Our data and our use of social media is being bought and sold. And so we are the products. We are being sold. I highly recommend, if you have time, to watch this documentary. It's an eye-opener. It really is strange the extent to which we are being manipulated by these advertising companies, by these corporations that are working with, and other political entities actually, that are working on these social media and mass media platforms. And so the danger is real, dear friends. Now the question is, what do we do about this? In the face of this major problem, we have an individual and collective responsibility, all of us. And this includes the following points. Number one, it's important that we choose our news sources and our sources of information, that we choose them wisely, and that we verify the information that we see and that we hear. We have to choose. In the past, some of you watching may recall that there was only a limited number of media outlets that you could listen to, or that you could read, or that you could watch and get your information. Now we live in a time where there is a virtually unlimited number of sources of news and information. And it's important that we choose wisely, that we recognize what is this source that we are listening to, that we are gaining this information from, and that we verify our sources and the information that we receive. And this requires that we develop a critical mind, dear friends, that we do not just accept everything that is given to us, that we avoid mindlessly consuming the information that we receive around us, that we don't just consume everything mindlessly. Very much in the same way that we would not consume any food put before us. Many of us, we ensure that the food that we consume in our bodies is food that, for instance, is permissible from a religious point of view, it's halal, that it is healthy, that it has no sort of chemicals or no harmful substances. We ensure that this is the case before we consume the food, because we don't want to harm our bodies. We don't want to harm the bodies of our family members and our children and our friends. So we ensure this. We verify the food before we consume it. In the same way, we have to verify the information that we consume. Yes, we are consumers of information, and we have to verify, where is this coming from? Who is the source? What is the source? And what is the information that is coming to me? And this is something that we have to not only do ourselves, dear friends, but also instill in our children. We have to teach our children to be critical thinkers, to verify their sources of information and news. Because our children and our youth are growing up in an environment where they have access, like I said, to a virtually unlimited number of sources. And they receive their information from everywhere, especially from the time that they spend on the internet, and the time they spend on social media. And they get information from every direction. It is a flood of information that they receive. And sometimes, of course, as children, as young people, they may not have the experience, the necessary intellectual experience, or the maturity to figure out what is real and what is not real, what is beneficial and what is harmful. And so it is the responsibility of parents, of older siblings, of friends, of community members, that we educate our children, that we educate the younger generation, so that they realize that not all of the information that they consume from the internet, from mass media, from social media is beneficial, that much of it is harmful, that much of it is dangerous to their mental health, to their spiritual health. And so it's important that we teach our children these skills. Now, what can we do? I suggest doing the following, asking the following questions when it comes to the information that we consume. Number one, it's important to ask, what type of content and what type of information is this? Is this a news story? Is it an opinion piece? Is this an advertisement? We have to figure out. And it makes a difference what kind of source and what kind of information it is that we are consuming. This is number one. Number two, it's important for us to ask ourselves, what or who is producing this information? Where is it coming from? Is it coming from a news organization? Is this a reputable news organization? Is it coming from a corporation or a business? Is it coming from a political organization? Is it being sponsored? Is it coming from a for-profit or non-profit organization? If it is being sponsored, who or what is sponsoring it, and for what ends? These are important questions. Because like I said, there are those around us, individuals, organizations who exist in the world, whose objective is to sell disinformation, to promote disinformation. And they spend a lot of money and a lot of effort in order to do so. So we have to ask, where is this coming from? Who is producing this information? Next, we have to ask, what are the sources that are cited? What is the evidence for the particular claim or information that is being given? Is it credible or not credible? If we are being told of an event that is happening, is this event based on eyewitnesses, those who were present, those who have knowledge directly or indirectly of the event, of the case, or not? If we are being taught something, the person who is teaching me this information, does this person have credibility or no credibility? These are important questions that we have to ask. Finally, we have to ask, is this information complete or is it incomplete? One thing that a lot of us end up engaging in is what is known as confirmation bias. That is, we listen to the things and the type of information that we like to listen to. That which makes us happy, that which makes us satisfied. Rarely do we listen to the other side of the story. Rarely in a debate do we listen to those who are on the other side of the debate. And so many times we end up consuming information that only confirms those things that we believe. This is referred to as confirmation bias. We have to ask ourselves, is this the complete story? Is there another side to this story? Is there another side to this information? And this is very important so that we can avoid misinformation and disinformation. And we have a wholesome picture when it comes to the information that we consume. Dear friends, in the face of the immense freedom that we have today when it comes to accessing information, and the virtually unlimited sources of information around us, we have a lot of responsibility. With this privilege, there's a lot of responsibility for ourselves and for our families. And so we must choose wisely. We must understand and distinguish between fact and fiction, between fact and opinion. We have to be able to verify not only the information that we consume, but verify it before we spread it and we share it with others. It's very tempting. It's very tempting, especially when there is breaking news, when there is something that sounds or looks amazing or outrageous. It's very tempting for us to want to share this news with others, to spread this news with family, with friends, on social media. It's very, very tempting, especially if we assume that it will generate a lot of interest, that a lot of people will read about it. It will, spread. It's very, very tempting. But we have to verify before we spread this information. We have to ensure that it is accurate information. And this is what the Quran reminds us of. God says in chapter 49, Surah Al-Hujurat, He says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِنْ جَاءَكُمْ فَاسِقٌ بِنَبَإٍ فَتَبَيَّنُوا أَن تُصِيبُوا قَوْمًا بِجَهَالَةٍ فَتُصْبِحُوا عَلَى مَا فَعَلْتُمْ نَادِمِينَ. O you who believe, if an indecent person comes to you with news, then be discerning. Be discerning. Verify that information. Don't just take it at face value. Don't just consume it. Ensure that it is genuine, that it is authentic, that it is true, lest you harm a people out of ignorance and become remorseful over that which you have done. You might not intend to mislead others. You might not intend to promote fake news or misinformation. But if you do not verify this information, if you do not ensure that it is accurate and genuine, then perhaps out of ignorance, unintentionally, you might end up misinforming others, deviating others, and then after that you will feel remorseful. So the Quran here reminds us that it's important for us to verify the information that we receive, no matter how small or insignificant it seems, that we ensure that we verify this. And in fact, this verse of the Quran reminds us that disinformation, that fake news, that propaganda is not something new. It's not something that has recently come up. In fact, it has a very long history. When it comes to Islamic history, we find that disinformation and propaganda was something that was prevalent or existed even during the time of the Prophet. After all, this verse from the Quran was revealed during the time of the Prophet. God is reminding the Prophet and the believers to beware of disinformation, of fake news, and to verify. And so there were campaigns, and there were individuals, and there were groups who were dedicated to creating disinformation and to spreading disinformation from the time of the Prophet through the early history, through the time of the Umayyads, and then through the time of the Abbasids, and beyond. Those who spread, who created fake news, and it came in many forms. It appeared in poetry. A lot of times in the early history of Islam, poetry was a tool, a device that was very prevalent. It was used in between people, in gatherings, in relaying information, just as mass media is and social media is today. And so poetry was one vehicle in which propaganda was spread, in which disinformation was spread. It was spread through stories. There were people who were professional storytellers who spread fantastic or fake stories about individuals or about groups, who spread them in society, and people began to believe these stories. Even hadith, this important source of religious knowledge that theologians, that jurists, that scholars would recognize as an important source, that the Quran itself would remind us to understand, to recognize the role of the Prophet as the teacher. Even the ahadith that were to explain the prophetic actions and the prophetic statements and those of the Ahlul Bayt and the Imams, even those were used for propaganda. Those were used to spread fake news and disinformation and to mislead and misguide people. Take the case of the Umayyads. Tonight we are on the eve of the month of Safar, the Islamic month of Safar, which is the second month of the Islamic calendar. And historians, they relate two very important incidents that occurred in the history of Islam in the beginning of the month of Safar. One of them is the breaking of all-out civil war, the Battle of Siffin in the year 37 after Hijrah, or 657 of the Common Era. The Battle of Siffin, it occurred over a long period of time, but the all-out battle began on the 1st of Safar of that year. And this battle occurred between two sides. On the one hand, there was Imam Ali, who was the rightful caliph at the time, and on the other hand was Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, who at the time was the governor of Syria. And we find that Muawiyah had amassed a great amount of power and support from Syria. He had been the governor of Syria for quite some time, for many years. In fact, he was in charge since the time of the second caliph, and then through the third caliph as well. And so he had amassed great wealth, great power, great prestige in the Syrian province, Ash-Sham, the Levant. And he had his eyes on the caliphate. He wanted, from the beginning, Muawiyah was someone who was obsessed with power, who was obsessed with amassing power and strength. And so he had his eye, as historians tell us, he had his eye on the caliphate. And when it came time for Imam Ali to receive the Pledge of Allegiance of the Muslims. They came to him after the murder of the third Caliph Uthman. They came to Amir al-Mu'mineen in the city of Medina, to Ali ibn Abi Talib, and the Muslims gave their Pledge of Allegiance. They wanted him to be their leader. So Imam Ali was formally recognized as the leader of the Muslims, as the Caliph. But Muawiyah, because he had his eyes on the Caliphate, he decided that he would reject Imam Ali, that he would not pay allegiance to Imam Ali, and so he set out to do so with force. Not only did he reject to pay allegiance to Imam Ali, but he also intended on waging war against Imam Ali. And this was the second battle or civil war during the reign or during the caliphate of Imam Ali. The first was the Battle of Jamal, which brought the Prophet's wife, Aisha, along with the two companions, Al-Talha and Al-Zubayr. And on the one hand and on the other side was Imam Ali and his army. After that battle, in which Imam Ali was victorious, then Muawiyah, he initiated this campaign, this battle of Siffin. And we find that this battle, historians tell us, led to the death of countless Muslims. Thousands and thousands of Muslims, they died in this battle. And in fact, even in the battle before. It was due to Muawiyah's determination to gain power, his determination to install himself and his Umayyad kinsmen as those who would wield power over all of the Muslims. And part of this was the propaganda machine of Muawiyah and of the early Umayyads. And we find three things that contributed to Muawiyah's ability to wage war against Imam Ali. Number one was this idea that was promoted by Muawiyah and by his propaganda machine, that Imam Ali was responsible for the murder of the third Caliph Uthman ibn Affan. Muawiyah pinned responsibility directly on Imam Ali. And in fact, this was not the first time. This occurred before in the first civil war of the Battle of the Camel, Jamal. They also did this. They also pinned responsibility on Imam Ali. So Muawiyah, he pinned responsibility of the murder of Uthman on Imam Ali. And this was despite the fact that during the troubling moments of Uthman, during the siege on Uthman, Muawiyah did not move an inch in order to show support to Uthman, despite Uthman being from amongst the Umayyads as one of his kinsmen. Yet he did not show him any support whatsoever. This was number one, that he blamed Imam Ali for the murder of Uthman. And so he presented himself as the one who was going to avenge the murder of Uthman. Number two is in the battle itself. Historians tell us that after the army of Imam Ali was able to succeed, to have the upper hand against the Muawiyah and his forces, that the commander of Muawiyah's army, Amr ibn al-As, who some historians, they say he was one of the primary agitators against Uthman ibn Affan, and which led to Egyptians coming from Egypt in order to assassinate and to kill Uthman ibn Affan. Amr ibn al-As was the commander or one of the main advisors of Muawiyah. Muawiyah formed an alliance with Amr ibn al-As so that together they can overthrow Imam Ali. And when Amr saw that Muawiyah's army was weakening, he decided to encourage Muawiyah to come out with an arbitration, a tahkim. And so the Syrians, they raised their Qur'ans on the lances, and this caused the battle to end, the fighting to end. And so this was part of Muawiyah's propaganda to show that they would allow the Qur'an to dictate which side was right. This was the purpose of the tahkim, was that the Quran would judge, the Quran would dictate which group was right. And this was despite Imam Ali's repeated attempts to remind Muawiyah and the army of Muawiyah of his place in the Quran, of his place as the rightful caliph. Yet this was one of the ways in which Muawiyah used his propaganda in order to deceive the people so that they assume that what he was doing was valid, it was religious, it was well-intentioned. This is number two. And number three, Muawiyah, according to historians, he instituted the cursing of Imam Ali for decades, for several decades, from the pulpits. And thus, even after Muawiyah died, those preachers who would preach in Syria, in that region, they would curse Imam Ali from the pulpits. And this continued as part of Umayyad propaganda against Imam Ali and against his family and followers for several decades. But this was not enough. So the first incident was that of the Battle of Siffin. The beginning of Safar also marks the arrival of the family of Imam Hussein to Damascus in the year 61 after Hijrah, after the tragedy of Karbala, the year 680 of the Common Era. They arrived to Syria, to Damascus, in the beginning of the month of Safar. And we know that Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, he continued this Umayyad propaganda against the family of Imam Hussein, against him and the family of Imam Hussein. That part of the disinformation campaign was to try to convince people that Imam Hussein and his family, they were rebels and they were seceders, and they were those who fought against the legitimate caliph of their time. This was the kind of news that was, and propaganda that was being pushed forth to the people. And this is why history tells us that in Karbala, when Imam Hussein stood in front of the Umayyad army, he had to repeatedly identify himself, remind the people who he was, that he was not some stranger, some rebel, but this was the grandson of the Prophet. And in fact, historians tell us that when he reminded the army, the Umayyad army, some from that side defected to the side of Imam Hussein. They realized who he was. Many of them had no clue. They did not know who this person was, who this group was. And we see this also in Syria, in the court of Yazid, where Yazid tells Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam, where when they enter, before they enter into the court of Yazid, some historians, they tell us that the city was one that was decorated, that it was a city, an environment of festivities and joy, because the people, they assumed that these were rebels who were caught, who were captured, and who were being brought forth before the caliph. This is what they assumed. Many historians, they tell us that when some people realized that this was the family of the Prophet, they were shocked, because they assumed, they believed, they actually believed, due to the propaganda campaigns, that these were rebels, that these were unknown individuals, people with nefarious intentions. And so Syria was decorated, Damascus was decorated. It was a time of joy and festivities. And even in the court of Yazid, this is why Imam Zainul Abidin stood up courageously and he identified himself in order to expose Yazid in his court, to remind people who he was. And as did As-Sayyida Zainab alayhi salam, she also exposed Yazid and his evil actions and his evil intentions in his court so bravely and so powerfully. But that's not enough. We find that this disinformation by the Umayyads against the family of the Prophet, against Imam Ali, against Imam Hassan, against Imam Hussein and the rest of the Ahlul Bayt, this kind of propaganda and misinformation and fake news would extend all the way into the modern period as well. Many times I'm told by friends around that when I tell them the story of the family of the Prophet and the challenges and the tragedies faced by them, many of them tell me that this is the first time that they hear these stories, that they were completely unaware. They did not know what was going on, that their scholars and their schools and their societies, they censored the truth and this information. And thus we find that this kind of propaganda still continues until this very day. We must ask God, the most merciful, and pray to God to enliven our hearts, to enliven our minds to the truth. Allahumma arina al-haqqa haqqan fanattabi'ah wal-batila batilan fanajtanibah. Oh, our Lord, show us the truth as it is so that we may follow it, and show us falsehood as it is so that we may avoid it. We pray to God Almighty to bless us, to bless our families, and to guide us to that which pleases God and to the truth, to bring relief and comfort to those who are sick, those who are ill, to bring comfort to us, the entire global community, so that we may overcome this pandemic, to bless the souls of those who have passed away. We pray to God to hasten the reappearance of our final Imam Al-Hujjat ibn Al-Hasan Al-Mahdi, wa ila arwah al-mu'minina wal-mu'minat نهدي جميعا ثواب سورة الفاتحة مع الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله.